All right, what's going on, guys? Today we are going to be breaking down a sample from my latest pack, which is the Square One Music Library Volume 12. This sample is one that I really love, like one of my favorites recently. I think I was able to accomplish a lot of different techniques that I like to think about or include in my sample making, and probably would make the most sense for me to play it and then kind of explain what I mean about these different techniques. So let's run through the sample and then we will, talk about it and break it down. All right, so there is obviously a lot to talk about with that sample, but kind of what I meant when I was talking about the different techniques that I like to think about while I'm making samples is, for one, this opens on a kind of authentic vintage style sample, which is a technique that I love using, a sound that I love trying to achieve. But even outside of the sound design, which I think it sounds pretty authentic as far as, authentic samples go or whatever. But, one thing that I really like about it is that it's a 16 bar loop. So this is already a lot more than what a lot of people are doing. A lot of times you'll get a 4-bar loop or an 8-bar max, but a 16-bar loop that repeats and sounds good is, not something that you see very often. And even something that I don't make very often, it's hard to do. The other cool thing about those 16 bars is that the first 8 could be used as, kind of a hard section for a beat with just a single note 808 pattern, because the bass in this pattern just is a repetitive bass. There's no chord progression going on here. You could just throw a repetitive 808 pattern on there. And then this second half of this 16 bars, there's a chord progression. So you could have an 808 that follows that chord progression. And because it's 16 bars, it gives, you could double up the first 8 bars and get 16 bars out of that and then have an 8-bar kind of bridge or something. But because it's 16 bars, you could just put it in like that and have an artist rap a 16-bar verse or whatever, and that's just the first section of this sample. We get into the next section and it switches from the authentic sound, the authentic vintage sound, to a more high energy synth section. So we're getting a 16-bar loop in the beginning that has 2 sections, a stagnant section and a section with a chord progression. And then the B section also has a stagnant section and a chord progression as well, but this time with synth sounds and, certain sounds from the first section that complement. And then on the C section, kind of the same thing. I have the sub playing here and more of the parts from section A. But then on the second half, I have a lot of synth stuff coming back in. So there's a lot of stuff going on here in this sample, a lot of sounds to choose from if you were to use this sample in a beat, or, especially if you were to get the stems version of the pack. You can make a lot of beats out of this single idea. So that's kind of what I was talking about at the beginning when I was saying it kind of encompasses a lot of things that I like to do. I think just a lot of different techniques that I really liked here in samples were able to be done in this one sample. And so I'm pretty proud of this sample. But as far as breaking it down, let's go ahead and start on this A section. That's where I started when I made it. And I think I just had the main line in my head. I think I actually started with the woodwind section though. And all that is, you can see the pattern here. It's just octaves. So the woodwinds were from Opus. It looks like I closed out of the woodwinds and opened up a string library here, but you can see I have orchestra woodwinds selected. So I don't know exactly which patch it was, but the woodwinds section is from Opus. Alone, that sounds like this. And the only plugin I think I had on it was just a directional mixer, kind of making it a little bit more mono so it wasn't so big. Because, these woodwind sections are recorded to sound big in a big open space. So I just kind of monoed it a little bit because there's not a ton of width on stuff on authentic vintage samples. When you go back and listen to vintage samples, a lot of the stuff is recorded in mono. So I like to try to replicate that by either doing mono or, making it close to mono. So it looks like I'm only at 30% stereo here. But all I'm doing is rolling off a little bit of the very top end on the woodwind section. Then the strings, as you saw, it was the same, these Hollywood strings. It was either the Hollywood strings or the symphonic orchestra strings from Opus. Again, just taking away a little bit of the stereo depth, and this is how the strings sound. So they're a little bit tucked back further than the woodwinds. Again, just same pattern as the woodwinds, just this. Then I have a passion flute playing and doing the same thing. And I had that little run there. But so this is a technique that I like to use when I'm trying to get a realistic vintage tone. I do this with strings as well, but I like to layer a orchestra section of woodwinds in this case with a solo flute, right? So you get kind of the depth of the orchestra, like I was saying, in the room with a little bit of room reverb or whatever. You get that depth, but then also you stack that solo one on top and you get the higher end and the close, more intimate, whatever sounding flute stacked on top. And I think that when you do that with these orchestral instruments, layer a full orchestra version in a room together with a close mic'd version, it really gives it a realistic sound. So altogether, it sounds like this. right, so those are the first three sounds. I guess we'll talk about the guitar here, because that, again, is just playing the same thing. So you can see the same notes here are being played as the two sections above that we just talked about. I was kind of able to get, that kind of Western or spaghetti Western twangy type guitar sound here. Very simple guitar part. I played that on my guitar just directly in. I can turn off all of the plugins so you can hear. I didn't, mic a real amp or anything. So the first thing we have is a UAD 1176 for some little bit of compression right off the top. And I just went into an amp. This is a regular, stock amp designer from Logic. After that, we went into a UAD V76 preamp. And this is something that I like to think about too. I like to try to think about, if I had all of this hardware, what would the chain actually be, right? Like the chain would be the guitar creates the sound. It runs then to a compressor pedal. Usually you would have a pedal version of a compressor. From there, it would go into the amp and be affected by the amp. You would then mic it. The mic would go into the preamp. The preamp would go into a compressor, like a hardware compressor. And then you could start affecting it with your EQs. So when I'm doing this sound design for these vintage samples, I'm always thinking about what the chain would actually be like if you were using all real instruments and gear. So anyway, after the amp, it goes to the preamp. And you can see I'm hitting it really hard. I mean, it's going all the way into the red. It's giving me a little bit of tone, maybe a little bit of saturation out of that. Then we're going into another compressor. Hitting it really hard. Then we have an EQ, boosting the highs, cutting out some lows. And then another EQ, rolling off even more lows. So that is the guitar tone, no crazy pedals or anything going on. We'll talk about the bass here. The bass is pretty simple. So on the first section, the bass is just doing a single note bass line like we talked about before. And everybody knows, it's the Rickenbacker bass. And then on the second half here, I have the bass line kind of going crazy. You can see it here. And I'm just following the chord progression that I put together, but also doing a lot of embellishments in there. So kind of a little bit of a busier bass line on the second half. In the first half, we have kind of the strings and the guitar and the woodwinds playing an actual melody. And on the second half, we have it just playing chords. So I thought it made sense for the bass to kind of be a little bit busier in that section. The only plugin on the bass is this Ampeg. I really love this on that Rickenbacker bass for whatever reason. So if you have this plugin, throw it on that bass. I think it sounds really good. I always can get good tones out of that. And we have the Rhodes, and the Rhodes that I'm using is the Vespertone Rhodes. I have an EQ boosting some highs, cutting some lows. I have a preamp just to get some of, I think I cranked it really hard again, get a little bit of saturation out of it. I have a directional mixer, making it almost mono, you can see. And then another EQ, just getting rid of a ugly frequency. But the chord progression, you can see I'm kind of following what the bass does. So I'm just playing the same chord over and over, just like the bass is doing. And then on the second half, just following the chord progression. And then that, that note on the threes, I thought sounded good. I thought that was a cool little addition to add, make that section a little more interesting. As far as these extra sounds go, on the first half, we have these flute runs and string runs, and I think they really add a lot to the sample. Those are both from Opus. There's runs in Opus for strings and flutes and all kinds of different instruments, and I thought they really sounded good in there. And so everything so far together sounds like this. So nothing really crazy going on. Even with the sound design, it's not really crazy sound design, but everything just kind of works together. It all sounds good together. And then down here, we just have some drum stuff going on. Crash, hi-hat, kick, another kick. It's just a bunch of different drum sounds that I just pulled into the project rather than, programming in Machine or something like that. I think almost all of these sounds were from Count. So one interesting note on that hi-hat, I have an outer space. So that's the delay that you hear on the hi-hat. But I think on most of them, all I really have are EQs. Yeah, it's just EQs on everything, and they're all going to this drum bus, and then I have just a little bit of compression on the drum bus. And then, on this part, when the chords come in and things get a little bit busier, I have the drums get a little bit busier too. I forgot to do the lead string though. So on the second half, we have this lead string come in, and this is the line that I came up with. Pretty simple, just kind of starting up high, running down. Again, is from Opus, and I just have a V76 preamp and a direction mixer. Nothing crazy going on for these instruments. So that's basically our first section here. A lot of layering of different instruments that are all kind of doing the same thing. Again, we have a simpler first half and a chord progression and kind of a little bit of a busier second half. So I'm really happy with how that came out. Now, going into this, I already knew that I wanted this big, grand sounding, vintage, authentic style sample to kind of be the intro and then drop into a crazier synth part. So that's what I did. So the main sound here is this ARP, and this ARP actually came from, I was having a day on the Prophet, just trying to patch different ideas and get ideas going on the Prophet, and I patched a pretty cool sound, and I started messing with ARPs, and I started just recording different arpeggios over top of each other to try to make something sound crazy. And that was actually like a week or two before I started this idea, and I thought, like, man, that ARP would sound crazy, if this vintage sample dropped out and that crazy ARP dropped in, that could be a really crazy kind of juxtaposition. So I went and grabbed that and had to kind of tweak it a little bit and make it work, stretch it a little bit, but I think overall it ended up sounding pretty good in this project. And you can hear there's actually two different arps there on the first two bars. You know, there's one on the left and one on the right, and then they swap for the second two bars. I wasn't able to get them separated because, like I said, it was from an audio file from before, and I couldn't get them separated in the original project or anything like that. So luckily it ended up working out though. But that's kind of the main driving sound of this second half, is that arpeggio. And I think in that original project I had a shaper box that was doing kind of a half time and then double time and then like regular time. So you can hear the arpeggios pitching up and speeding up and slowing down and whatever, and that was because of shaper box. All we have on that is two EQs. We have just a regular Logic EQ really boosting the highs, and then this Playback, which is also just giving us more of a boost around 8,000. I really like this Playback for that really high frequency knob that they have there. Next we have a sub. And that was actually the Mini V3. I originally put a bass from the Prophet 6 in there and couldn't get it to sound right, couldn't get the tone right, couldn't get enough sub out of it. So I ended up pulling up the Mini V3, channel EQ, micro shift, and then two ultra maximizers just to kind of level that sound out and really push it and try to get some saturation and stuff out of it. And then I also ended up adding a decapitator on it as well. I wanted a bass sound in there to kind of hit on every other bar, but not be too distracting from what was going on. But when it's in there, it kind of gives you that downbeat. And then these two little sounds here, they came from the Prophet 6 going through the arcades pedal with the lo-fi chip in. And I haven't touched the arcades pedal in probably a year, and I actually was trying to sell it. And out of nowhere, I was like, you know what, let me just try that and see if I can get some cool tones out of it, because this sample was basically done, but I wanted just a couple of extra little effects in there. And I was like, let me pull up this arcades and see if I can get a cool sound out of it. So I ended up getting these two sounds out of it, and it just worked perfectly to really set the synth section of this sample off. You know, so just two pretty simple sounds, but they really do a lot of work here. Like when it's just these two sounds playing, it sounds pretty boring and repetitive. And then you add those two little sounds in and it really makes a big difference. You know, it just kind of brings the energy up. And then I still kept those flute and string runs in here because I thought that was another thing to kind of bring that energy up. All these little arps and siren type sounds and string runs and flute runs and all of it together, I just thought really helped keep the energy high. And then the guitar comes in again. And then on the second half of the pass here, we have the Prophet 6 chords come in. And that just followed the same chords that I played on the Rhodes. And I don't think I ever even showed what the chords were, but here they are. So it's A minor, B minor, C, F sharp minor 6. That's the chord progression, simple chord progression. So I just followed that on the Prophet 6 to get these chords. The sub is playing here, and then also another bass is playing from the Prophet 6. And I just thought that complemented the sub sound because it didn't have a lot of sub, but it had more of that, had a little bit more mids and higher tones than that sub did. And I thought it sounded good with the chords. So the only thing on here is a little bit of compression and a little bit of EQ on the chords. And I think the synth bass just has compression. I had to move over to the Waves LA2A because I was running out of Universal Audio juice, whatever that is called, DSP or whatever they call it. And additionally, the ARP got double timed here. So it's the same exact ARP, same exact, processing, but I just stretched it to double time it. And the guitar continues here. And then on the C section here, it's just basically just variations of what we've already heard. Right, so this part goes back to playing just the woodwinds and the strings without, the guitar playing in there from the beginning and without the drums. On the second half, we get the synth sounds coming back in. In addition to the synth sounds that we heard in the B section, we also have a synth kind of lead solo come in. That was another thing from the Prophet 6. Only thing I have on there is an EQ, some compression, and then I have this X noise on here just to get rid of some of the noise that was coming through the Prophet when I recorded it. For whatever reason, I was getting a lot of clicking and popping. And then here I have another one trying to put the high end back in after removing the noise. That section sounds like this. And then this last thing here is just one note. So that was just trying to end this solo on the root note. And then also I ended up actually bouncing the first bar of the original idea from the beginning and then putting a little chunk in here at the end. It kind of reminds me of Kanye, Gorgeous from Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. I think that's how he ended Gorgeous on that song. So it's just a quarter note delay on the outer space. And I thought that was like kind of a cool way to end it. So that is the sample. The last thing that's worth mentioning is the bus. Everything, you can see everything went to this bus. Well, not everything, but all of the authentic vintage sounds went to this bus. I think that this bus is equally as important to the overall sound as getting the right sound when you're designing the original sound. So, the Rhodes, I didn't just load up a Rhodes patch and let it be normal. I added some effects to it. Same with the bass, I added this amp. Even the flute, I added some EQ and directional mix. So I try to get things sounding good and on the right track before going to a bus. But then after I have everything sounding pretty good, I send it all to a bus so that it can be all affected together. Like it was all, again, thinking of how old studios would have worked. All of the instruments at the end, all of the tracks at the end would go through all of the same analog gear together to be printed onto the final vinyl or the final cassette, whatever it's going to be printed onto. It would all go through the same stuff together at the end. So that's kind of what I'm trying to emulate here. Let's turn everything off and play it, and then we'll go through. So, you can hear that as a drastic difference already. So the first thing is a compressor. Looks like I'm getting 2 to 3 decibels of reduction. Then we have an EQ rolling off some lows, and everything below 300 is getting pushed down almost 3 decibels. No, nothing crazy. Then we have a J37. And on this, I have the saturation put up quite a bit. I have a little bit of noise introduced here, but the main thing I was trying to do is get this flutter. I love the flutter from the J37. I put the flutter up pretty fast, and I actually go pretty deep with the flutter. I think that is one of the best ways to get like an authentic tape sound, is to mess with that flutter. So, you know, getting a little bit of extra tone, a little bit of extra saturation and flutter from the J37. Nothing crazy though. Next we have a radiator. And on this, I'm pushing the input pretty high. You can see when it comes in, it's going pretty far into the red. Again, just trying to get more saturation, more tone out of everything. And this mix is even put down pretty far because I think I was hitting it kind of hard and getting a little bit of distortion. I turned the mix down pretty low. Little bit of extra treble, little bit of roll off on the bass. After that, we have another EQ just scooping out somewhere around 520. Then we have a soothe. Looks like I was having some trouble around 1.7K. After that, we have a Kramer tape, so another tape emulation. And I think the only thing I really did on here, I think I just messed with this flux knob. I like the flux on this. That's another one of the knobs on one of the tape emulators that I really like. I like the way that that flux knob makes stuff sound. And then, so this is a pretty drastic EQ here. We have everything below 115 is getting rolled off. We have a big scoop here at 580 that kind of blends into that high pass. And then we have a big curve up here in the high mids and the highs, and then a roll off at around 10,000. This is the most drastic EQ. I was really trying to get the most difference in tone here. And that really brightens it up and makes it not so bass heavy. Then we have a pitch, bringing it down one semitone. Then we have a mid side, and it looks like I was just trying to get a little bit more width out of all of it. Even though I made each of the instruments mono, I like to then go back later and pan them and make it a little bit wider. And so looks like I'm putting the stereo width up to about 120% and then just boosting the volume of the sides. And then one last EQ where I'm pushing that high end up again. So looks like I rolled it off in the last EQ, didn't like it, and ended up pushing it back up, and then even cutting out more lows. So this is, again, a testament to these little changes add up. You can see I have a lot of plugins going here. And when you put each one on, it doesn't sound that different. But when you A and B the whole bus, you know, you get a drastically different sound. That is something to think about. Try to get your instruments sounding good on their own without any kind of bus, and then go back, run everything to a bus, and get them to sound even better. That is really something that I've been doing a lot, and it has really been allowing me to get really, really good tones, especially when I'm trying to get these vintage tones. That is the sample. Again, this is the first sample in the Square One Music Library Volume 12. It's called Olympic Gold. I hope you guys learned something from this one. Hope you liked it, and as always, thank you so much for the support.